Hello everybody, welcome back to How to Read a Poem. Who is God? What is God? What is the nature of religious belief? What is the relationship between God and the self and the soul? Can we prove the existence of God? Can the soul speak to God? Why is God silent? Why is there evil and suffering in a world ruled by a benevolent God? Now these questions are questions that have puzzled, burdened and intrigued people from the beginning of time. Today, we're going to talk about a poem, The Absence, which treats these questions in the form of a paradox. It's by the great Welsh poet R.S. Thomas. Now, in his earlier poems, R.S. Thomas is concerned with the relationship between the disappearance of the Welsh language and the language he writes in English. His early poems are full of the beauty and the terror and the hardship of the Welsh landscape and how it shapes its inhabitants. Later on in his poetic career, he turns to precisely his great theme, the question of religious belief, the representation of God in religion, and how God is characterized by a certain sort of absence, which is at the same time presence. So this is the motto that's going to dominate this poem. It's broken up into 4 stanzas and it is focused on the individual soul and his cry out to God and how the soul comes to deal with a God that seems in times of need to be absent. So the first stanza starts, it is this great absence. Religious belief is defined by an absence. It's not about addressing a God that's present, that answers all questions. In fact, Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish film director, one of his very famous films, Winterlight, talks about the silence of God and man's agony at that. R.S. Thomas puts a more positive spin on this, but he's quick to emphasize that God isn't present, God is this great absence. Second line, that is like a presence. So we get the first instance of this paradoxical idea that dominates the poem. God is present, but he is also absent. In fact, he is present in this absence. And so, how can the rational mind deal with this paradoxical idea of God who is both there and not there? But R.S. Thomas suggests this might be precisely the definition of religious belief, believing in spite of the absence of evidence. So it is this great absence that is like a presence that the word is compels. It's a forceful verb. It's a verb that resembles a kind of religious pull. It compels the soul to address it without hope of a reply. So God is absent, God is silent, but it is precisely this silence that urges the soul towards God, urges me to address it without hope of a reply, to talk to God, to enter into a relationship with the divine without any hope of a reply, without any hope of an answer. This, R.S. Thomas says, is the crux of religious belief. You address something, you base your entire belief on faith. Faith is something that, as the great philosopher Soren Kierkegaard suggests, requires a leap of faith. It is believing in the absence of any scientific, rational evidence that might compel a sort of easy belief in a divinity that answers prayers. We don't have this consolation, R.S. Thomas emphasizes. So it compels me, it draws me towards addressing it, towards praying to it, towards acknowledging that God is a God that escapes, that exceeds language, that exceeds easy representation. So without hope of a reply. It is a room I enter from which someone has just gone. So the poem now turns to metaphorical representations of precisely this relationship between the soul and God. So God is like a room I enter from which someone has just gone. God has already left. So I'm entering it too late. So there might not be the physical presence of somebody in the room, but his metaphysical presence is something that I intuit. We might think of the implied idea of somebody who's just left the room, somebody who's physically gone, but somebody whose presence still lingers on. And that, R.S. Thomas says, perhaps is what God signifies to the religious believer. the vestibule for the arrival of one who has not yet come. R.S. Thomas plays with this idea of time. So if we were in the earlier metaphor too late for God's presence, now we are too early. So the room changes to a vestibule. Again, the room, the vestibule, places that hold something, places that await the arrival of something, of someone. So the vestibule for the arrival of someone who has not yet come. I modernize the anachronisms of my language. So this idea of how do I speak of God? How do I represent God? How do I capture faith and religious belief? If there might be something outdated, if there might be something ancient about the language of the Bible, about the language of the Old Testament, science has kind of suggested a modernization. R.S. Thomas emphasizes the relationship between God and not only religious belief, but also scientific belief, but also the development of history. So, no matter if the soul modernizes the old-fashioned nature of the language, God is no more here than before. So, if God exceeds our easy grasp, He also exceeds our easy comprehension through language, through the various ways and means in which we try to sense that there's a divine presence, that there's a philosophical proof even of God's existence. God is more than that. God cannot be easily capturable through our language. And perhaps precisely this is the nature of God here. So I modernize the anachronism, again a continued reference to the idea of time that's been played with in the second stanza. He's no more here than before. Genes and molecules have no more power to call him up than the incense of the Hebrews at their altars. So again, this sense of past and present. The reference to genes and molecules is a synecdoche, which means it's a part that represents the whole. What is the whole? Science. So in the narrative of Western civilization, science has replaced religious belief. We might like to think of ourselves as advanced, ourselves as modern people. We can explain the world through science. We don't need religious belief. Religious belief might seem outdated, superstitious, antique, a thing of the past. So how do we understand the world? R.S. Thomas implies the modern man understands it through genes, the biological basis of our humanity, we might say, and molecules, scientific evidence. But these things have no more power to call him up. God is not reducible to science. If we seek a rationalistic, a scientific explanation for God, we are likely to fall flat. But he doesn't also valorize, he doesn't also put on the pedestal the language of ancient religious belief, which is encapsulated in the phrase, the incense of the Hebrews at their altars. So we can't have it either way. We can't have a God that is reducible to the tenets of science, and we can't have a God that is easily reducible to religious language also. So the poem seems to use paradox to put us in a sort of standstill. How then do we call out to God? How efficacious is religious belief? What is the nature of faith? The poem has so far posed all these questions without arriving at an answer. So my equations fail as my words do. Again, there's that acknowledgement that what we have is failure, that what we have is the ultimate inadequacy of mathematical, of scientific language, and of rational discourse, language to capture the essence of God. However, the poem ends with the rhetorical question which provides a kind of tentative solution. What resources have I other than the emptiness without him of my whole being, a vacuum he may not abhor? So all these things have failed the self then realizes that religious belief is ultimately something personalized, is ultimately something intimate. It is my own awareness of my sinfulness. It is my own awareness of my inadequacy to grasp after God, which nevertheless motivates me to call out to Him. So what resource have I other than the emptiness? That absence, that emptiness now becomes a source of strength, now becomes the only guarantor of the authenticity of religious belief. So we have this emptiness, we have this sense that God is absent, we have this sense that God is silence. But that is precisely the exact condition that God needs to enter the soul. So what resources do I have other than this loneliness, this metaphysical isolation, this emptiness of my whole being? So the self needs to be emptied. The self needs to be, in a sense, without arrogance, without posturing, without pretentiousness, without falsely grasping after inadequate solutions. So what I have to give God is the sense of my complete aloneness, is the sense of my complete sincerity. It is a vacuum. The self needs to be emptied of all pretensions. From the start, we get empty room, we get empty vestibule, and now the metaphor starts to take on an extreme form. We need a vacuum. We need a place that is emptied of everything, of every solution, of every rational explanation. In that posture of faith, God may enter. God may deem the individual soul worthy to enter into a sort of deeper, more authentic, more genuine religious conversion, religious conversation with the soul. And God, He may not abhor. The language is tentative. The language is ultimately supplicatory. In other words, the soul calls out to God. The soul is petitioning God to enter and to fill up the soul and to suffuse it with a sense of religious peace. So the poem concludes with this tentative prayer, we might say, almost a sort of penitent supplication to God. It is in this emptiness, it is in this absence that God's presence is the best intuited. If you think this seems strange, if you think this seems too paradoxical, do take note that the Bible is full of paradoxical language. So in a sense, R.S. Thomas draws on the deepest religious traditions to suggest a kind of more authentic conversation, a more authentic intuiting of who God is, what God represents, and ultimately how God is present in this overwhelming absence. This has been How to Read a Poem. Thank you.